A murder-suicide rocking the Capitol, leader of the opposition condemning gender-based violence, and the BCC also crying out against the same issue. Good evening, everyone. I'm Tyler Simonet with your JCN News for this Monday, January 24th. An alleged murder-suicide rocking the Capitol over the weekend as a young mother is left dead, allegedly at the hands of her boyfriend, who, at last update, was listed in critical condition in hospital. The victim has been identified as Heavenly Tervius, while the alleged shooter has been identified as friend Ron Ferguson, the father of her son. On Saturday evening, the piercing screams of loved ones filled the air on Miami Street as they mourned the tragic loss of the 21-year-old photographer. Investigators told reporters on the scene that sometime shortly before 6 p.m. on January 29th, officers heard word of a shooting incident in that area. Police Press Liaison Officer Superintendent of Police Audley Peters provided reporters with additional information.
Our preliminary investigations reveal that the male and female are partners in a relationship, and shortly before the incident occurred, the male came to the residence and entered a room, locked the door behind him. Other members who were present at home heard gunshots, and on gaining entry into the residence, they found the male and female on the ground. The evidence indicates at this time that the male would have entered that residence, produced that firearm, and shot the female, and then turned the firearm on himself.
Superintendent Peters says that a 1-month-old male infant was taken to hospital. That infant was discharged Saturday night. Superintendent Peters also noted that evidence suggested that the male was not a resident of the home. With the matter still in early stages of investigation, Superintendent Peters could not give reporters a clear motive for the matter. However, he did say this.
There are all kinds of innuendos and scenarios going out in the media. The officers have to conduct themselves based on evidence, and the evidence will come from all the nexus of the persons who are involved after communicating with them, checking the history of the relationship. Are they known to the police in terms of making complaints before we can make a final determination? That's why I said the evidence suggests a certain pattern, and until we prove otherwise, we're going to have to follow the evidence in this instance and in all other instances where we're investigating matters of this nature.
News of the fatal shooting has sparked outrage on social media, with renewed calls for an end to violence against women. In light of this tragic incident, Superintendent Peters sends this message to the public.
Most definitely that there is a cautionary tale in that all of us, when entering into a relationship, we have to be discerning as to the person we decide to enter relationships with. And in entering relationships, we also have to do that, exercise ourselves and use best practices to ensure that our relationships are wholesome and affords us mutual benefits. And when you desire to leave a relationship, use the necessary tactics that would encourage you to exit that relationship without causing injury to both parties.
Investigation into this matter is ongoing. Opposition leader Michael Pintard says the Free National Movement believes that the country must move aggressively to better finance agencies that assist women and children so that they are not in vulnerable positions. His comments come off the heels of an alarming spike in violent crimes towards women and girls over the past 2 months, and in particular the murder of a young new mother over the weekend.
And when they are negatively affected, whether it's by stranger or a male familiar to them, that we assist them in transitioning in safe spaces. So we need to better resource those services in government. We need to better resource the crisis center, which does not only cater to women and children, but also to men who are also sometimes victimized by violence, whether it's mental violence, physical violence, financial violence, etc. So we affirm with respect to those matters.
That said, Mr. Pintard asks, what are we going to do collectively to send the right message in terms of how we ought to deal with the conflicts we are having?
That is, relationships that began as loving relationships but have deteriorated, where there can be an altercation in a public place and persons who are not known to each other, men savaging women, how do we get the right message to the society in general, men in particular, about how we ought to deal with conflict, to deal with anger, and so on. So I'm saying these are pivotal issues that the government, who has the power today, we're saying we're certainly willing to work in concert with them, work in concert with the faith-based organizations, with the Crisis Center, with other agencies that have that as a responsibility.
Asked if the social programs and legislations put in place to safeguard the treatment of women and children in society have the teeth to ensure that they're actually protected, Mr. Pintard says this.
Well, insufficiently, I mean, clearly. So we have yet to move legislation to address the issue mentioned earlier, and that is the issue of marital rape. It is a taboo subject for some to talk about, because there are some persons in the society who believe that this cannot happen. Right?
What are your personal views?
No, my personal view is that we ought to move the legislation, that the government ought to bring that legislation. There are drafts that are already available, and so we ought to bring that. Let's have a discussion with the public to get all sides of the view. And I'm on record as saying that the legislation is absolutely important.
Mr. Pintard was a guest on Love 97's show Issues of the Day with talk show host Kristen Jones. The Bahamas Christian Council decries domestic violence, especially those against women and children. In a press release sent out by the BCC, they extend sincere condolences to the family of the young lady who was shot and killed over the weekend while holding her 1-month-old son. They note that recently, the Bahamas has witnessed too many incidences of domestic violence that resulted in the tragic loss of life, and we are in a state of crisis, and the only way we can make a change is if we all take a stand, not just to verbally express our dismay, but to take definitive action that will result in meaningful change. They call for the laws dealing with domestic violence to be amended and for penalties to be stiffened for the perpetrators of these heinous crimes. The BCC appealed to all relevant stakeholders to join forces to do what is necessary to ensure that these and all other acts of violence and crimes are minimized and eliminated from our society. The BCC strongly encourages all churches to make this a core focus to sound the alarm. The BCC strongly encourages all churches to make this a core focus to sound the alarm from the pulpits, to open your doors to those in need of counseling, and to speak truth to power. They stand ready to lead the charge in reclaiming our nation and working in tandem with law enforcement to restore our country to law and order. They say that it is their prayer that all citizens and residents of the Bahamas would unite in love and service to eradicate all manner of criminal activities, from the seemingly small and insignificant to the big and life-altering. That said, wife of the Prime Minister and advocate for ending domestic violence against women and girls and men, speaking out off the heels of a woman being murdered allegedly at the hands of her boyfriend this weekend. Mrs. Anne-Marie Davis says she would be remiss if she did not raise the issue of parental leadership in the wake of this tragedy. As she says, characters and value systems are formed, shaped, and nurtured in the home. Mrs. Davis is calling for stronger parental leadership surrounding the manner in which the nation's young boys and men are socialized to interact with and treat our young girls and women. She says the level of recorded abuse and violence against our girls and women points to a sharp deficit in parental leadership, adding that as a society, we must work together to fix this. Additionally, she says that institutions of the state have to become more proactive, intrusive in the personal lives and affairs of our citizens, especially when and where there is evidence that the health, wellness, and personal safety of security of our children and women are at risk, in peril, and under threat. She says we must continue to use our collective voices, including NGOs and civil society, to bring about greater public awareness to this issue while we aggressively agitate for stronger public and social policy measures to stamp out domestic abuse and gender-based violence, as we cannot continue to be muted bystanders who suffer in silence while this evil proliferates around. A former health minister is calling for the Prime Minister to do the honorable thing following Mr. Davis's admittal of breaking quarantine last month. Our Leah Cooper spoke with Dr. Sands this afternoon, and here she is with that report.
Former Health Minister Dr. Dwayne Sand is calling for Prime Minister Philip Davis to resign following the Prime Minister admitting last week that he broke quarantine last month to pay a bill at a store downtown after business hours. On December 23rd, Mr. Davis revealed that he was in quarantine after his wife, Anne-Marie, and other family members tested positive for COVID-19. The Prime Minister, who is fully vaccinated and has taken the booster shot, said he took multiple COVID tests and each returned negative. That night, the husband of former Cabinet Minister Melanie Griffin, Leon Griffin, was murdered in front of his home, and Mr. Davis revealed at his memorial last week that he was one of the last people to see Mr. Griffin in person.
We find this to be absolutely extraordinary, to have the nation's Prime Minister, who had been in quarantine less than 24 hours, find it so important to leave quarantine, to do something that he had many options for dealing with. He wasn't trying to deal with a matter of the state. It wasn't an executive challenge. He had to pay a bill. And his utterances made it very clear that he felt it necessary to hide his movement from the Bahamian public.
Now, the Office of the Prime Minister has since released a statement indicating that at no time did the Prime Minister breach the regulations in the Health Services COVID-19 Prevention and Management of Community Spread Rules 2021, implemented by his administration, as the Prime Minister was not ordered into quarantine by a medical doctor, as described in Article 19 of the Health Services COVID-19 Prevention and Management of Community Spread Rules 2021. To that, Dr. Sand says this.
If you read the reports written around the 23rd and 24th and 25th of December, the story just doesn't add up. And so I think the Prime Minister owes the Bahamian public a full explanation as to why he did what he did, why he said what he said. And I think that this story leaves a lot to the imagination, and there should be some repercussions.
Now, back in May of 2020, Prime Minister Philip Davis, who was opposition leader at the time, called for Dr. Sands to resign following Dr. Sands' actions related to 6 permanent residents who landed in country with COVID-19 testing supplies and were allowed to quarantine at home before they produced a negative COVID-19 test result. He previously criticized the move, calling it a, quote, show of hypocrisy.
The Prime Minister and the current Minister of Foreign Affairs had a lot to say about protocol and convention when there were challenges in the previous administration, and in particular with regards to COVID protocols with the then Minister of Health. They had an awful lot to say about what the honorable thing should be. Well, let's see how honorable the Prime Minister is at this point.
Opposition leader Michael Pintard also slammed Mr. Davis's comments last week, charging that Mr. Davis' public admission to breaking the COVID-19 quarantine law enacted by his own government is a betrayal of his oath to uphold the law. Reporting for JCN News, I'm Leah Cooper.
You're watching JCN News. Stay with us.